What is the greatest I'll do it myself moment in history? John Stapp, Air Force doctor who was convinced that more pilots could survive if their seats didn't disintegrate on crash landings. He proved it by strapping himself into a Mythbusters-style rocket sled and not dying. His work led to safer planes and cars. By riding the decelerator sled, Stapp demonstrated that a human can withstand at least 46.2 grams in the forward position with adequate harnessing. This is the highest known acceleration voluntarily encountered by a human, set on December 10, 1954. Stapp reached a speed of 632 miles per hour, 1,017 kilometers per hour, which broke the land speed record and made him the fastest man on Earth. Famous writer Roald Dahl, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the BFG, James and the Giant Peach, etc., developed and patented a surgical device to treat children with traumatic brain injuries. Dahl had no medical training, he just did it. Dahl's 4-year-old son was injured in a car accident and developed dangerous pressure on his brain due to swelling. Surgeons installed a shunt in Dahl's son's skull to drain fluid and relieve pressure, but it kept clogging. There was no better solution on the market, so Dahl worked with a toy maker to design a new shunt that drained fluid without clogging. Dahl was able to patent the design and it was subsequently used to treat thousands of children. The woman who delivered her own baby by C-section. I guess she has several kids and knew the baby was in distress, but her husband was at the bar. So she took a shot of alcohol and delivered the baby. They all lived, even the husband. Dr. Tracy Dixon Salazar, who went and got her PhD in neurobiology because her daughter was having seizures and nobody could tell her why this was happening and nobody could treat her daughter. She found a treatment when nobody else could. Incredible woman. English Dr. Edward Jenner noticed that milkmaids who had caught cowpox, a close genetic relative of smallpox with significantly reduced virulence, did not seem to catch smallpox when outbreaks would occur. As a result, he hypothesized to other physicians that infection with cowpox could be used to prevent smallpox, but they didn't buy it and essentially laughed him out of the room. Jenner proceeded to infect his gardener's 8-year-old son with cowpox and, after the boy recovered, exposed him to smallpox repeatedly, effectively demonstrating his initial hypothesis to the initially skeptical medical community. Jenner's On the Origin of the Vaccine Inoculation, wherein he published his results, set the foundation for the first smallpox vaccine and, eventually, the eradication of the disease altogether. John von Neumann was one of the greatest mathematicians of all time. However, he kept being frustrated by the physicists never being able to build a properly working computer to do his calculations, so in 1945 he basically said, "F*** it, just do this and describe the architecture which is basically the foundation of all modern computers." Which is referred to as von Neumann architecture. Dude was also part of the Manhattan Project, a pioneer of game theory, and did analyses which preceded the discovery of the structure of DNA. Absolute monster of an intellect. John Walsh's son was abducted from a Sears in 1981 and his decapitated head was found 2 weeks later. The rest of his body was never found. They were never able to pin the murder on anyone. John Walsh got involved in victim advocacy and started America's Most Wanted, helping capture more than 1,000 criminals, some of which were on the FBI's most wanted list. It was eventually determined, with minimal evidence, that a serial killer named Otis Toole was Adam's killer. To this day, department stores commonly have a code Adam, named after Walsh's son, to help locate children who were lost or abducted from public spaces. Edit: Adam Walsh was 6 when he was abducted and murdered. Benedict Arnold. Horatio Gates was useless at the Battle of Saratoga, and the two men hated each other. Halfway through the battle, Gates relieved Arnold of his command. Seeing that the American counterattack was stalled, Arnold rode out and rallied the troops from the front, saving the day and directly leading to the British surrender. In the process, he was shot in his left leg, which was then crushed as his horse was also shot out from under him. When Gates' messenger finally arrived to order him to return back to headquarters, Arnold had to be carried back in a litter. The animosity between Gates and Arnold caused Gates to refuse to acknowledge that Arnold had participated in the battle at all. Gates was more astute politically, and the Continental Congress sided with Gates, which was a major contributory factor in Arnold's later treason. Meanwhile, Gates was given command of the Southern Army, led it to great failure, and was removed. After the war, Arnold allegedly asked what would happen if he returned to the US. He was told they would build a monument to his left leg and hang the rest of him. I've told this story before, but I went to the dentist many years ago to have a rotten tooth pulled. The dentist, who was highly skilled and qualified, numbed me up, grabbed the pliers, attached them to the tooth and pulled. Nothing happened. It didn't help that she was pretty small and simply didn't have the strength to do it. She apologized and said she'd go and get a beefier colleague, but I'd have to wait for half an hour since the other dentist was out at lunch. I said, that, I do it myself. So she put the pliers over my tooth. I checked with her about 5 times that it was the correct tooth, and gave it an almighty yank. Finally, out popped the tooth. It turns out the reason it was so recalcitrant was that it had 3 roots instead of just 2. Anyway, I got a discount of £2.50 for doing the job myself. Liu Bang was a minor functionary in Imperial China. He was once in charge of moving a group of prisoners from A to B, but they escaped. The penalty for allowing this was death. Unsurprisingly, he felt this wasn't ideal, so he began a rebellion which ended with the fall of the, I misread this bit, 5 centuries old, Qin dynasty, and Liu becoming the Gaozu emperor, founder of the Han dynasty and considered one of the greatest Chinese emperors. Returning from his campaigns across the Indus River, Alexander the Great was marching towards home, sacking cities along the way, expanding his empire. One of the tribes, the Mali, pulled back into their walled city to concentrate their forces. They were strongly resisting along the walls, but Alexander was in the heart of the battle leading his troops. At one point, Alexander was on the wall, just he and his closest retainers, his shield bearers, and saw an opportunity to enter the city. He jumped from the wall, almost alone amongst the enemy, to press the attack. His troops hadn't advanced as far as he had and weren't able to join him. Seeing his impetuous leap, his men panicked and stormed their ladders so quickly they broke, leaving him alone in an enemy stronghold fighting them off. His troops would eventually join him, but for a time in was Alexander the Great and his shield bearers' backs, against a tree holding off the forces of an entire city. The man who invented the automatic switchboard, switchboards used to require a person to physically move a cable to connect the call, did so because his funeral home wasn't getting any customers. The lady operating the switchboard was the wife of his rival and was redirecting the calls to her husband. Instead of complaining to the phone company, which would have probably gotten her fired if they found sufficient evidence, he took matters into his own hands and made her entire job obsolete. The hunter Jim Corbett had more than a few of these. Born in India during colonial times, he had a deep love for the country of his birth, and when he heard villages were having problems with man-eating big cats, he lent his services as a keen shot to protect the local villages. It's reckoned from logs that were kept, that the big cats he slew had killed over 1,200 people altogether. The deadliest of which was the infamous tiger of Champawat. It was a female Bengal tiger that had a documented 436 victim kill count. Corbett eventually found her by following a trail of blood from a 16-year-old girl it had killed and dragged off into the wilderness. The maddest thing is, he went on all of these hunts on foot and alone. Later on in his life he ended up putting his efforts towards conservation. The catalyst for which was that he realized a lot of these man-eaters had damaged teeth and were actually killing the humans out of starvation, as they could not attack their regular prey with tougher hides anymore. The Jim Corbett National Park in India has the highest numbers tigers residing there of any of its national parks. Teddy Roosevelt Jr. in 1944, he is Brigadier General Roosevelt, and Deputy Division Commander of the 4th Army, and he is 56 years old and walks with a cane. On June 6, 1944, he is watching his men board the landing craft for the assault on Normandy, and he is adamant that he join them, but everybody above him keeps saying he cannot go, for his own safety. Finally, they give up, and let him land within the first waves. He was the first general and the oldest man to join in the first wave. But his boat is thrown off course, they do not land where he expects to land to follow through with the assigned mission, and his other troops' boats as well. Some are advocating to go up the beach a mile to where they were supposed to be, but he personally did a reconnaissance tour, gathered his men, and declared we'll start the war from right here. And they did, and they succeeded in gaining ground and securing the beachhead. Too long, didn't read, nobody else wants to do it? I will. I'm not where I should be. It, let's go to war. Maria Oktyabrskaya, who bought a tank to get revenge over the Nazis who killed her husband. After her husband was killed fighting in 1941, Oktyabrskaya sold her possessions to donate a tank for the war effort, and requested that she be allowed to drive it. She received and was trained to drive and fix a T-34 medium tank, which she named Fighting Girlfriend, Borsanopira. Oktyabrskaya proved her ability and bravery in battle, and was promoted to the rank of sergeant. After she died of wounds from battle in 1944, she was posthumously made a hero of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union's highest honor for bravery during combat. She was the first female tank driver to be awarded the title. In 1947, Joseph Jones became blind. He considered all his options and decided his mobility needs would best be met by using a guide dog. He applied to all the existing schools, but he was declined because of his advanced age. He was only 57 years old. So he says, "F you guys, I start my own guide dog training school and give the dogs away to people that really need them. 77 years later, Guide Dogs of America still is doing this important work for hundreds of people. I want to say Florence Nightingale. During a time women weren't allowed to do much of anything, 1850s, she basically took it upon herself to taking nursing, predominantly male at the time, if I remember correctly, and revolutionize it. According to Wikipedia, her contributions to the Crimean War reduced the death rate of the wounded from 42% to 2% by introducing concepts such as basic hygiene and better living conditions. It's through her efforts the entire field of nursing is what it is today, more or less, over 100 years later. An old Italian tractor manufacturer by the name of Ferruccio Lamborghini was dissatisfied with his shiny red sports car. He had a fairly big spat with the guy who built it, a fella named Enzo, who was way more focused on racing his cars than dealing with his annoying customers. Old Ferruccio eventually told Enzo to kick rocks and took the car to his own garage to fix it. He took the car apart and found that the supposed sports car he purchased used the same clutch that he was putting in his tractors. He was understandably upset. So he vowed that day to beat this tiny angry Italian at his own game. Whether or not he succeeded, he sure as heck set the groundwork for some of the zaniest, fastest, and craziest vehicles to exist on this planet. Werner Fussmann, the German physician who invented the methodology for cardiac catheterization. He came up with the idea and pitched it to the head of the cardiology team at his hospital, who dismissed it as too dangerous. So he performed it on himself, inserting a catheter into his own heart through the vein in his wrist to prove that it worked. He was promptly fired from the hospital and ended up winning the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1956. John Snow, not that one, the father of epidemiology. No one believed him that the cholera outbreak, in what is now Soho, was because of a contaminated water pump. He broke it. They arrested him for vandalism and held him until the outbreak suddenly ended. Gavrilo Princip. I have no idea how this is not the top and only answer here. After being a member of a failed assassination attempt on Archduke Ferdinand, he was having a coffee a few blocks away when the Archduke's driver made a wrong turn down the street. Gavrilo said, "It, I'll do it myself," and started World War I. Dasharat Moji, also known as the Mountain Man, was an Indian laborer from the Glore village in Bihar. He is renowned for his incredible feat of single-handedly carving a path through a mountain using only a hammer and chisel. This arduous task took him 22 years, from 1960 to 1982, to complete. Moji decided to carve the road after his wife, Falguni Devi, passed away due to the lack of timely medical treatment. The nearest town with a doctor was 70 kilometers away, and the mountain obstructed a direct route. By creating a 110-meter long, 9.1-meter wide, and 7.6-meter deep path, Moji reduced the distance to the town to just 15 kilometers, significantly improving access to medical facilities for his village. His remarkable determination and perseverance have made him a symbol of the power of human will and dedication. Moji's life story has inspired books, documentaries, and the 2015 Bollywood film Moji the Mountain Man. Callum's Road, Isle of Raasay, Scotland. Callum MacLeod lived in Arnish, which is in the north of the very remote island Raasay in Scotland. This small community was miles from the nearest road. He and 100 people petitioned the council for a road to connect them to the south of the island, but the request was rejected. Over the course of 50 years he watched the community decline. Due to the lack of connectivity, people left the north of the island, and by the late 60s there was only 2 people left, Callum and his wife Lexi. One morning Callum placed a pick and axe and a shovel into his homemade wheelbarrow and with his bare hands spent the next 20 years of his life building what is now called Callum's Road. Robert Kurtz invented the intermittent windshield wiper and forced Ford and Chrysler to pay out. He first approached Ford with the invention and they loved it and proceeded to make their own wipers without Kurtz. He was his own lawyer when we went against Chrysler. He got settlement offers but insisted on fighting it to make Chrysler pay out, eventually winning $30 million just from Chrysler. There's also a movie about it. I don't know how true to life it is, but it's a good watch. It's called Flash of Genius. Neil Armstrong, the first human in history to attempt to land a vehicle on the moon, was slowly approaching the planned landing field when he realized it was unexpectedly full of huge boulders the size of a VW Beetle. At the same time, he was getting urgent error codes from his primitive navigation computer that was getting too much data for it to process and was forcing a reset. And finally, his precious fuel reserves were running very low and he was quickly approaching the point of forced abort, or no return. He simply ignored the computer and took manual control of the craft, off script, and flew, just looking out the window, until he found a flat patch of lunar land he thought suitable. Eagle successfully landed with literally seconds of time left for fuel when he announced, "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." I'm not sure people still appreciate how on the fly his incredible landing was. Also of note, his nickname was the Ice Commander, apparently from his work as a test pilot, where his heart rate during flights was recorded to be steady and calm, not elevated under the most stressful possible circumstances. Russian surgeon, Leonid Rogozov, got appendicitis while on an Antarctic mission. He had to operate on himself. Dude pulled his own guts out, to remove his own appendix, without anything except local anesthetic, so he could keep a deer head and finish the operation. He had 2 guys assisting him, and he had shown how to inject him with adrenaline, should he lose consciousness. Absolute badass. On a very small scale, the dude who engineered the only main road on the island of Saba, in the Dutch Caribbean. In the 1940s there was a rudimentary road from the harbor to the main town of the Bottom, but the rest of the villages on the island were linked only by footpaths. The Sabins appealed to the colonial authorities in Curaçao for help in building a road to connect them, but were told the terrain was too difficult. So local guy Lammy Hassel got himself a correspondence degree in engineering, and designed the damn road himself. It was constructed by hand over a period of about 15 years, and it's had a few widenings since then, but we still use it today. Charles Babbage is considered by many to be the father of computing because he designed mechanical computing devices a century before electronic versions. Problem was, the tools to create the intricate parts that made up the devices did not exist. So he said, "Fine, I'll revolutionize tooling and manufacturing." And did. Ironically, his mechanical computing devices never got past the prototype stage in his lifetime, although years later they were built based on his designs, because he ran out of funding, but the innovations he made to manufacturing changed the world. Donald Knuth is one of the big names in computer science. Back in the 1960s he set out to write the definitive texts on computer programming and analysis of algorithms. The first 3 volumes came out and he started the 4th in the early/mid-1970s. He was unhappy with how the newer printing/editions were typeset, and so he took a summer to solve that problem. A decade later the 4th volume still had not been completed, but as a consolation prize we got TeX, later extended to the more commonly used LaTeX, without question the most comprehensive and powerful language for creating documents with heavy technical requirements. It is a strange mix of a markup language like HTML and a compiled language like C. It is completely free and has been for well over 30 years, and it is probably the most bug-free piece of software I've ever seen. Certainly for its size and scope, there's not much out there of comparable quality. There is literally no mathematics that cannot be properly typeset in TeX/LaTeX. Its default style is instantly recognizable to any working mathematician. It is used across nearly all STEM fields, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of journals that only accept manuscripts written in LaTeX. It wasn't until the early 2000s that drafts of the 4th volume started to appear. Nobody has seemed to mind. The Battle of Little Bighorn during the Sioux War in June 1876. Probably the greatest failure of a I'll-do-it-myself moment in American history. Lieutenant Colonel George Custer's 7th Cavalry Regiment had been tracking a Lakota village, which was constantly moving following the nomadic lifestyle of native tribes on the Great Plains, and upon successfully locating it, decided to attack at once. He chose to attack with his regiment of about 700 men without waiting for another 2 infantry regiments and 2 cavalry regiments to arrive from separate columns. As it turned out, the village was around 20,000 in population with somewhere between 1,000 and 2,500 warriors. Custer's attack on the village resulted in over a third of his men being killed, including himself, and the possible capture of the regimental colors and several company guidance. The loss was an immense blow to the U.S. Army and a significant scandal at the time. Custer's decision to attack without waiting for additional forces was motivated by several factors. Although Custer's Crow scouts advised him the village was much larger than any native village seen before, Custer himself could not see the village's size upon personally observing it. Custer was used to native villages/encampments being very small and easy for 1 cavalry regiment alone to handle. He also knew that his own regiment's camp had been discovered by a pair of Lakota hunters, and mistakenly believed they fled to warn the Lakota camp. This pressured him to attack as soon as possible. Note, the village was actually occupied by Lakota, Dakota, Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples. For the sake of brevity, I refer to them as Lakota. I'm going to mess this telling up, but during World War I at the Battle of Liege, Germany had just invaded Belgium and needed to take the city of Liege, which was surrounded by 12 forts that all could cover for each other. Well, no battle with this kind of weaponry had really been fought up to this point, so the Germans didn't have a sound strategy for taking the city or defeating the forts. During the battle, the First Army arrived a little late along with their commander Erich Ludendorff, who ended up leading the entire German armed forces later in the war. Anyway, at some point during the battle, Ludendorff gets separated from his army but somehow ends up in the middle of the forts with access to the city of Liege. He rolls up, by himself, and I believe literally bangs on the door of the garrison stationed at Liege and demands their surrender. The Belgians, convinced that no sane general would arrive at a garrison alone, believe that the forts have fallen and the German army must surely be at the city, so they surrender to the solitary Ludendorff.